Imagine this. You stand in a grand, candlelit hall, somewhere between the Renaissance and a dream. The air is heavy with perfume and secrets. A nobleman, draped in velvet, bows before a woman cloaked in silk and silence. She does not speak. She doesn't have to. Her glance alone orchestrates the room like a conductor commanding a symphony of power. The men speak bravely about battle and conquest, but none dare cross her. It's not fear in their eyes. It's reverence. Something deeper, something ancient, something they don't understand, but obey. Now imagine centuries later. The costumes change, power suits, hashtags, corporate offices, movie sets, political chambers. Yet the same silent choreography continues. A different world, but the same law. Why? Why is it that across eras, cultures, and ideologies, beneath the surface of patriarchal boasts and masculine domination, there is an unspoken script of control that bends toward the feminine? Why do even the most powerful men, kings, emperors, presidents, CEOs, often find their greatest vulnerability in the presence of a woman? Why do empires rise from their touch and collapse from their absence? Machiavelli saw it, not in the open chapters of The Prince, but between the lines, a whisper beneath the clashing swords and courtly intrigue. He never stated it outright, not because he lacked the words, but because he understood the weight of naming it. Some truths, if spoken too boldly, shatter the illusions that keep the world spinning. And Machiavelli was no fool. He wrapped his most dangerous insights in silence, trusting that only the truly perceptive would ever glimpse the outline of what he feared to write. So, what is this secret law? This ancient code that women wield, not as a weapon but as an essence? Could it be that true dominance has never needed to shout? That the most potent form of power flows not from the throne, but from the shadow behind it? Think. Helen launched 1,000 ships with her beauty. Cleopatra bent Rome with her mind. Catherine the Great outmaneuvered armies without lifting a blade. In modern times, look beyond the scandals and headlines. Behind every fall of a mighty man, you often find the echo of a woman's influence, whether in love, betrayal, inspiration, or revenge. Is it seduction? No, that's too shallow, too easy. Is it manipulation? Still too crude. What if it's something deeper, an unspoken sovereignty rooted not in force, but in psychological gravity? A gravitational pull that warps the minds of men, not through deceit, but through a dance older than language itself. A kind of metaphysical leverage that bends logic, ambition, even morality? What if domination isn't always about conquest, but invitation? You were taught that power is about control, firm hands, loud voices, decisive actions. But what if the most powerful force is the ability to evoke, to awaken desire, guilt, loyalty, chaos, transformation, to reshape another's world from the inside without ever claiming to hold the reins? Now ask yourself this: why has history hidden this truth? Why has it been buried beneath layers of philosophy, theology, politics, and psychology? Why has no textbook called it by its name? Because acknowledging it threatens the very myth of masculine dominance. And yet, it's there, not as an attack on men, but as a riddle to those brave enough to see the invisible strings behind their actions. Why do men create? To impress. Why do they go to war? To prove. Why do they seek power? To be worthy. But to whom? You already know. There's a phrase Machiavelli used sparingly: Fortuna, the embodiment of fate, chance, the chaotic feminine force of the universe. He spoke of the need to conquer her, but deeper still, he feared her, because Fortuna was not just luck. She was woman. She was nature. She was unpredictability and allure, nurturing and wrath. He wrote, "Fortune is a woman, and it is necessary, if you wish to master her, to conquer her by force." But perhaps this was not bravado, but a confession of weakness. Perhaps he knew that no conquest lasts, that power seized through aggression only lasts until it exhausts itself. But power granted, willingly, subtly, and silently, now that endures. So here's the question that hangs in the air like incense. What if the real rulers of history were never crowned? What if domination, the kind that truly lasts, does not roar, but whispers. And what if, century after century, we have all been participants in a game where the rules were never written, only felt? In the next moments, we will go deeper into the psychological, philosophical, and spiritual forces that have shaped this phenomenon. We will confront ideas that threaten your sense of self, your beliefs about gender, and your understanding of power. But before we move on, ask yourself, have you ever really been in control? Or have you been dancing to a rhythm you never chose? Beneath the surface of desire, power, and seduction lies a force so deeply woven into the fabric of human psychology that most never see it coming. It's not about romance. It's not about gender roles. It's about something older than civilization, something buried in the archetypal structures of the human psyche. Something that Machiavelli glimpsed, Jung dissected, Nietzsche warned about, and Schopenhauer loathed. The hidden law is this: he who appears to rule is often ruled by what he cannot name. Power, when it is most effective, does not scream, it suggests. It does not command, it invites. And nowhere is this more potent than in the psychological theater between the masculine and the feminine. Carl Jung called it anima, the inner woman in every man. Not a literal woman, but the emotional, intuitive, elusive dimension of his soul that he either represses or worships. And here is where the trap begins. When the masculine psyche is not whole, when it has not integrated its own anima, it seeks it in the external world. Not as a partner, but as a symbol. And once she becomes a symbol, she becomes powerful. Not because she claims it, but because he gives it. He gives it willingly. He gives it blindly. He gives it with trembling hands, mistaking his surrender for love. Nietzsche, in his Fury and Madness, touched this truth when he wrote, "Ah, women, they make the highs higher and the lows more frequent." He wasn't being poetic. He was bleeding, for he understood that the moment man forgets himself in the gaze of the other, he ceases to act as a sovereign being. He becomes a mirror, reflecting back her desires, her disappointments, her mysteries. This is not a condemnation of women. No, this is the diagnosis of a deeper affliction: psychological disintegration. A man without a solid sense of self becomes vulnerable to the gravitational field of the feminine, especially when it wears the mask of admiration or need. She doesn't even have to manipulate him. She merely has to be, and his own unresolved inner void will do the rest. Arthur Schopenhauer, though bitter and often dismissed as a misogynist, exposed something many dare not say aloud: that the desire for woman is not love, but a metaphysical trap, an illusion cast by nature herself to continue the species at the expense of the soul. He saw woman not as a person, but as an archetype, a force of life disguised as affection. In other words, she is the abyss that promises meaning but demands surrender. Viktor Frankl, from a more humane and redemptive lens, revealed that the human being cannot live without meaning, but warned that when meaning is projected onto another person, it becomes dependency. Those who have a why to live, he said, can bear almost any how. But what happens when that why is not your own? What happens when the source of your purpose is external, placed in the hands of another? You become manipulable. You become enslaved, not by force, but by your own craving for completeness. And this is the law Machiavelli hinted at in whispers. He observed the courts of Florence, where men in armor bowed not only to kings, but to courtesans, where decisions of war were made after a night in a woman's chamber, where legacies were rewritten by the flutter of an eyelash. He watched men die with honor on the battlefield and beg with shame at the feet of their lovers. What is this power? It's not seduction. Seduction implies intent. But the deeper power comes from the unconscious spell cast by projection, when a man sees in a woman not who she is, but who he needs her to be. This is the real danger. Not the woman's manipulation, but the man's blindness. Jean-Paul Sartre warned that hell is other people, but what he truly meant is that hell is our dependence on them for identity. And nowhere is this more evident than in the erotic bond, where love, lust, and longing intermingle into a psychological haze that men rarely escape unscathed. Think back. The first time you felt desire, pure, unexplainable, inescapable, was it really about her? Or was it about something she awakened in you? Something you felt was missing? Something you believed only she could complete? This is the architecture of the secret law, a structure of longing built on the illusion of fulfillment. And it has ruled kingdoms. It has guided revolutions. It has caused men to betray their cause, their comrades, and themselves. But don't mistake this for victimhood. This isn't about blaming women. This is about confronting the abyss within, the part of the masculine psyche that fears emptiness so much it would rather kneel to fantasy than stand in solitude. Because here's the ultimate irony. The feminine does not dominate by demand. She dominates by being the reflection of what the masculine lacks. And so long as the man seeks outside what he has not yet found within, he is bound. Psychologically, existentially, spiritually. This is why religions have both worshipped and feared the feminine. Why mythologies cast goddesses as both mothers and monsters. Because she represents not just beauty and comfort, but chaos, temptation, and the unknown. She is not the villain. She is the mirror. And the question is, what do you see when you look into her eyes? Until you answer that you are not free. Until you answer that you are not whole. Until you answer that you are living under a law older than Machiavelli, deeper than politics, more binding than chains. So the question is not whether women dominate men. The question is, why do men give them the throne? In the next section, we'll see the true cost of this unconscious surrender, the consequences that unfold silently in relationships, culture, and even global power structures. Because the secret law does not merely affect love. It infects perception, ambition, and the very meaning of identity. And it's time to face what happens when the dream becomes a cage. Imagine a king who believes he's ruling an empire. His seal on every document, his voice commanding armies, his throne elevated high above his subjects. But what he does not see, what he dares not admit, is that every word he utters, every decree he makes, is first whispered to him by the woman behind the curtain. Her name is not in the records. Her face is not on the coins. But she is the gravity to his orbit. Without her gaze, he is aimless. Now ask yourself, how many modern men are kings of empty kingdoms? The tragedy of the secret law is not just in the giving away of power. It's in the quiet devastation it leaves behind. When a man molds his identity to fit the imagined desire of the feminine, he becomes a ghost inside his own life. His goals no longer emerge from authentic yearning but from subconscious bargaining. If I become what she wants, I will be worthy. If I provide, she will love me. If I win, she will stay. But she never asked for this. And even if she did, the self built on transaction is always insecure. This is the unseen consequence. Psychological erosion. The soul of man slowly dissolving in the acid of unspoken dependency. He becomes a chameleon, adapting not to survive but to be loved. He loses the ability to say no, not out of virtue, but out of fear. He cannot confront her disapproval without feeling that his very existence is on trial. Cognitive psychology identifies this as intermittent reinforcement, the most addictive pattern known to the human brain. When reward is uncertain and unpredictable, it binds deeper. So when affection, validation, or intimacy is given inconsistently, the man becomes addicted not to the pleasure itself, but to the possibility of it. He waits, he hopes, he adjusts, he shrinks, and all the while he believes he is choosing this path. But he's not choosing, he's chasing. B.F. Skinner's pigeons were trained this way, pecking a button, not knowing when food would come. They pecked more frantically the more erratic the reward became. The same mechanism drives modern men to abandon their missions, to betray their principles, to spiral in jealousy and submission. And society applauds it as romantic. Happy wife, happy life. But what if that mantra is a symptom, not a solution? What if it's the slogan of the defeated? Look around. The man who once dreamed of building cities now builds apologies. The boy who once imagined himself a warrior now asks for permission to speak his truth. The father who once stood tall becomes a shadow in his own home, drowning in silent resentments, anesthetized by distractions, terrified of conflict. And worst of all, He tells himself he is being good. But goodness born of fear is not virtue. It is obedience. And obedience to an idealized feminine is the throne room of the secret law. Zoom out, and the consequences become cultural. We are witnessing the rise of what Nietzsche called the last man. A being who seeks comfort above all else, who avoids pain and confrontation, who trades greatness for safety. This last man no longer dreams of mastery. He dreams of acceptance. He is harmless, agreeable, politically correct, emotionally available, and utterly lost. He writes love poems on Instagram while his ancestors bled in battlefields. He apologizes for wanting too much. He confuses shame for humility. And in his heart something dies. Because deep inside every man is a warrior archetype. Not a killer, not a tyrant, a being designed to carry weight, to face chaos, to speak truth, to protect without asking for permission. When this archetype is denied, not by law but by love, when a man feels he must amputate his fire to keep affection, he will either implode or explode. Implosion looks like depression, anxiety, addiction. Explosion looks like violence, control, emotional withdrawal. Neither is power. Both are symptoms of a deeper disease. Self-abandonment in the name of feminine approval. And again, the feminine is not the villain. It is the mirror. Society has taught her to expect devotion, emotional labor, hyper-attentiveness, and psychic attunement. Not because she is evil, but because men offered it freely in the hope of acceptance. And what is freely offered is rarely respected. Women don't want perfect men. They want whole ones. But a man cannot be whole if he is hollowed out by the endless attempt to be enough in someone else's eyes. Jean Baudrillard once warned that we now live in a simulation. A hyperreality where signs and symbols replace truth. Relationships today are simulations. Love has become branding. Men curate their personalities like social media profiles, removing the rough edges, hiding the rage, masking the ambition, downplaying the desire. But truth cannot be curated, and neither can power. The unseen consequence of the secret law is not just individual pain. It is civilizational decay. When men no longer lead themselves, they cannot lead others. When men avoid truth for peace, they create silent wars. When men outsource identity to intimacy, they abandon destiny. And deep down, they know it. That's why resentment festers. That's why divorce rates rise. That's why men either retreat into passive nihilism or erupt into performative masculinity. Red pill rants, cold showers, and alpha slogans that scream confidence but conceal trauma. Because when the center collapses, the extremes take over. So what's left? A battlefield of boys playing men. A culture where domination wears the mask of empowerment and submission wears the mask of virtue. A world where the throne is invisible, but the crown rests silently on the head of whoever controls validation. And Machiavelli would smirk, because the greatest ruler is the one who rules without ever lifting a sword. Now, a question you must ask: what would your life look like if no woman could validate or reject your worth? Who would you become? Because until that man is born, you are still living under the law. A law you never signed. A law you were born into. A law older than your name. But the rebellion is coming. In the next section, we'll tear through the veil. We'll meet those who broke free, who dared to be whole in a world addicted to halves. We'll explore how the masculine can reclaim its throne, not over women, but over the self. Not through domination, but through integration. Because the antidote to the secret law isn't war, it's wholeness. And only the whole cannot be ruled. Now picture this. A man sits in absolute stillness. No phone, no music, no gaze to catch, no one to impress. His breath is slow, his posture relaxed, but there is something behind his eyes, something ancient. He is not waiting for anything, not praise, not permission. He simply is. And in that being, he radiates a force not taught in schools nor captured in trending hashtags. This is not bravado. This is sovereignty. It is the look of someone who has broken the spell. The rebellion begins not with protest but with awakening. Awakening to the brutal truth that for centuries, men have been conditioned to believe that their emotional, social, and even spiritual worth is validated through the feminine lens. that unless they are chosen, they remain incomplete. But what if the entire premise is flawed? What if a man does not rise by being chosen, but by choosing himself? This is not an incitement against women. It's an invitation to men to stop playing the roles, to stop performing for affection, to remember who they were before the world told them what to be. Carl Jung once wrote that a man who fails to integrate his shadow is destined to be ruled by it. And this is the first act of rebellion, meeting the shadow. The anger you repress, the need you hide, the desire you shame, the self-respect you traded for warmth. These are not your enemies. They are your compass. You do not become whole by amputating yourself to fit someone else's idea of lovable. You become whole by reclaiming the parts of you that you abandoned. But this reclamation demands solitude, silence, brutal honesty. You must ask, who am I when no one is watching? When no woman is watching? And most men avoid this question because they fear the answer. They've spent years living through projections, trying to be what the feminine wants or what they think she wants. But rebellion is choosing to face the emptiness, the confusion, the hunger, and not flinch. Nietzsche spoke of the Übermensch not as a tyrant, but as the man who creates his own values, who lives beyond good and evil, beyond approval and shame, beyond the morality that was handed down like a leash. This is not lawlessness. It is self-law. It is the masculine awakened. And you cannot be dominated by what you do not need. The secret law only has power when you are waiting for reward. Break the reward system. Renounce the throne she never gave you. Build your own. There is a reason the ancient mystery schools demanded long periods of isolation for initiation. Not because loneliness is noble, but because until you can stand in your own silence and not feel terror, you are still a slave to noise. And the modern form of noise is the gaze. The feminine gaze, the gaze of social media, the gaze of your lover, the gaze of your mother. Rebellion is becoming invisible, not to hide, to unhook. Unhook from the performance. Unhook from the need to be seen to feel real. This is why the desert fathers walked into the wilderness. Why samurai sat for hours in meditation before drawing their blade. Why Stoics trained in discomfort. Not to impress, but to remind themselves that they already were. Rebellion is not flamboyant. It is quiet, resolute, internal, and it is contagious. Look through history and you'll find rebels who understood the law and bent it. Marcus Aurelius ruled with grace because he needed nothing. Leonardo da Vinci refused courtly games because his passion was truth, not flattery. Even Machiavelli himself, cynical and sly, admired those who could move through the world ungoverned by desire. His prince was not a brute. He was strategic, sovereign, incorruptible. And here's the paradox. The man who no longer seeks domination over the feminine becomes profoundly attractive to it. Why? Because presence is magnetic. Wholeness is irresistible. Not need, not manipulation, but the steady flame of a man who could walk away from the palace and still feel like a king. Who can love a woman with depth and clarity, but never sacrifice his core to keep her. Who knows how to be tender without becoming small. This man is rare. This man is dangerous, because he cannot be ruled. And women, consciously or not, sense it. They test it. They admire it. And often they fear it. Not because it threatens them, but because it reflects their own unintegrated shadow. Just as men have projected identity onto women, women have projected safety and purpose onto men. The game has always been mutual. The liberation must be mutual too. But one must start. Let it be you. The rebellion, then, is not war. It is a return to essence, to a state before the roles, before the scripts, before the performances. It's standing in front of a woman and seeing her not as a judge, not as a mirror, not as salvation, but as another sovereign being. Only two whole people can love. Everyone else is negotiating. This is the masculine healed, not alpha, not beta, but integrated. Not above women, not beneath them, beside them, free. So let the boy die, the boy who sought to be liked, approved, protected. Let the man emerge, the man who speaks truth, feels deeply, walks alone when needed, and does not barter his fire for affection. That is rebellion. And here's the final secret Machiavelli hinted at, but never said aloud. The man who cannot be ruled is the only man who can truly love, because he has nothing to gain from pretending, and nothing to lose by walking away. Now imagine this, you're standing in front of a mirror, not the kind that flatters you with light or filters, but one forged in silence, loss, and love unreturned. A mirror that does not lie. You stand there stripped of your roles. Not a son, not a lover, not a boyfriend, not a husband, not even a man in the way society defines it. Just presence, breath, being. And in that unbearable stillness, something fractures. Something ancient. It is the moment you realize that every battle you've fought, every attempt to win love, to earn validation, to bend the world through charisma or control, was driven by one unspoken fear, that you are not enough without being desired. This is the last illusion, the final frontier, the place where even the strongest men hesitate to tread. Because what lies beyond it is not power, but a death of who you thought you were, a death of your false self. But here's the revelation Machiavelli never spoke, at least not openly, because the world was not ready. The domination wasn't hers. It was yours. You gave it, freely, repeatedly, unconsciously. All the times you thought a woman was controlling you, she wasn't. You were controlling yourself on her behalf. You made yourself small. You smiled when you didn't want to. You chased when you knew you should have walked. You apologized not for your actions, but for your existence. Not because she asked you to, but because you feared the silence that would follow if you didn't. And this is where the truth splits the soul. No one can dominate you without your consent. No one can diminish you unless you need them to elevate you. You were never under her spell. You were under your own. A spell made of conditioning, of childhood wounds, of unresolved archetypes. A spell that whispered, be good, be sweet, be useful, and maybe you'll be loved. But you were already worthy, not because of what you offer, not because of how you make her feel, not because of your strength, your sacrifice, your humor, your depth, but because you are. You exist, and your existence is not on trial. This is the final realization. It unhooks you from the matrix. It renders you ungovernable, not in a loud, rebellious way, but in the most terrifying way possible. You no longer need to be needed. You no longer crave the gaze. You no longer define yourself by who chooses you, praises you, or stays. You are free. And this is when everything changes, not just within you, but around you. Because when you become sovereign, when you no longer outsource your soul for affection, the world begins to rearrange itself. Relationships shift. Desire purifies. Love deepens. Because now it is not built on need, but on truth. And here's the divine paradox that no one wants to admit. When you no longer need her, you can finally see her. Not as an object, not as a mirror, not as a prize or a threat, but as a soul, a being. And this is when true union becomes possible, not domination, not submission, not transaction, but communion, co-creation, fire that doesn't burn but illuminates. Because now you're not coming to her as a beggar, or a boy in search of a mother, or a performer hoping for applause. You're coming as a king who doesn't rule, as a man who has remembered himself. And in doing so, you give her the greatest gift, freedom from having to complete you. She is no longer your mirror. She is no longer your redemption. She is no longer the gatekeeper of your worth. She is just her. And in that space, something sacred returns. The play, the dance, the divine polarity, not to gain power, but to express it, not to dominate, but to merge, not to seduce, but to celebrate. And this is the secret Machiavelli hinted at with trembling fingers behind closed doors, that the greatest power is not to rule others, but to rule yourself in the presence of others and remain whole, especially in the presence of the feminine, because that is where most men dissolve. That is where most kings abdicate. But not you, not anymore, because now you know the final truth. She never had the crown. You gave it away. You placed it at her feet and begged for her blessing. And the moment you stopped doing that, not with bitterness, not with anger, but with clarity, you become untouchable, unshakable. You become a force, not against women, but for yourself, for your ancestors who lived asleep, for your sons who will one day look into your eyes and ask, "What does it mean to be a man?" And you will not point to conquest. You will not point to charm. You will not point to performance. You will point to your stillness, to your gaze, to your unyielding center, and say, "It means I remember who I am, even when no one else does." That is freedom. That is the end of domination. That is the birth of the real masculine. Not performative, not reactive, but rooted. The man who walks through the fire of rejection and no longer burns. The man who looks into the eyes of the feminine and no longer flinches. The man who finally remembers, "I was never meant to be ruled.